When you have a loved one that receives a diagnosis of Alzheimer's, what's your greatest fear? There are so many to choose from, but a few common ones are the fear of them wandering off and the fear of them becoming aggressive or angry. Our guest today has experience with both and is going to share with us what it was like and how his family coped. This is The In-Between Years, a podcast about caregiving and all the things you wish you knew but no one talks about. I'm your host, Holly Westervelt, and I'm here to guide the real talk about all the things we wished we could have discussed but didn't. Today's guest is Richard Rusoff. He is a long-term care insurance specialist with the Krause Agency, and he has decades of experience helping agents and clients put protection in place to support their care needs in cases just like his. Richard loves to teach others and to help them understand the need for long-term care insurance. And he loves to find the right solution for every situation. And I can personally attest that he is very, very good at this. He comes at this conversation with deep personal experience, which we're going to get into soon. Richard is the proud son of Morton, and he's going to share today about Morton's journey with Alzheimer's. So Richard, thank you for joining us today. So I know your story is pretty broad, and we're going to get into all of that, but I do want to start with Morton. And if you could, maybe just tell us about him before the diagnosis, and then maybe how you figured out that he was maybe starting to have problems.
Dad was a World War II veteran, and that's part of the story because he did come home with PTSD, played into his personality and the end result of his life. He was decorated. He had a Bronze Star and a Silver Star. He was a medic, carried people out off the battlefield, was rewarded in the book, The Jewish War Veterans. So he's very proud of the 45th Division out of Oklahoma. He lived and breathed that till the day he passed away. He was a good father. That time of growing up, he was attentive to us, but strict, as people were in those days. A lot of people say, well, he's my hero, but no, he was my dad, and that he did his job. So we give him credit. But unfortunately, he did have his battles with the PTSD and eventually with the dementia.
And that's such a struggle. Well, first off, it sounds like amazing service that he gave back to our country. And, PTSD, that's tough. That is definitely, I'm sure, a tough thing that he and your family went through in growing up. So tell me, when the dementia started coming on and you started noticing that, tell us about that and what that was like.
Well, that started very simply. My mother said that Dad has been prescribed Aricept. Now, I had been in the business for about 3 years at that time, so I was aware of what that was. Didn't really know the reason why. I was kind of doing something different in business at that point, but a coworker of mine sold them a small home care only policy. So that's the first thing that came to mind, that, well, we made a good deal 3 years earlier by insisting that they buy this small policy. And that was the end of discussion in my mind. But I think that was a rude awakening. And then my mother would start to describe to me on every phone call the things that he was doing. The policy was a basic policy, $50 a day for 1 year. That was available in those days. Mm-hmm. And then he started to do things that were a little bit out of the ordinary, forgetting basic things. Here's a guy that was an avid reader. He could read books in 3 different languages, spoke to, when he was starting to be forgetful, we took his keys away, things like that. That was the beginning.
Yeah. And that's tough. And starting to see those kind of things and recognizing those things, taking the keys away, all things that maybe we think about a little bit, but I don't know that we always talk to our families about what that's going to be like and when is the right time. How did you guys decide it was the right time to take away the keys?
Well, he never was a great driver. Let's put it that way. He was a Manhattanite in New York and he never drove till he was, I think it was 1950, a little bit after they got married, actually. My parents were married for 60 years, so he got his license very late in life. So that was not a hard conversation. I think he understood. At that point, he was, more cognitive than nothing. But it was when he started wandering when we got nervous. He would take walks out of the house at 2 times. We had to call the cops to find him and bring him back, and we had to lock the door from the inside. And when he was asked why he was doing this, it was primarily because he thought he was in Paris, because during the war he fought in Anzio, and he went in France and Africa, and we had cousins in Paris, and there was a photograph or a picture in our house, and he would stare at this picture for hours, and he thought he was there. And when he walked out of the house, he said he was going to visit cousin Ginny, and that was for him down the block in the picture. And so that's when we figured that, we better start locking up the house. And at that point, his personality started to change. Angry outbursts. Interestingly enough, the angry outbursts came out in German.
Wow.
He didn't really speak German, but he read it. So I don't know how that happened, but that was, another sign that things were changing. And fortunately or unfortunately, I didn't live near. I lived in Florida, and they lived in New York. So the burden was on my mother and my sister, who happened to live very close to my mother's. Well, I think one of the things that we did up front, in addition to buying the policy, was having discussions. So we did talk about it. We did lay out a plan, and we supported each other. At no time did we have a negative discussion. I think that's important for everybody to take from this.
Sure. I think you said a couple of really important things there. Number one, there was some coverage, and I want to talk more about that in just a minute. But two, your family talked about it ahead of time and therefore didn't have conflict. And I don't think that's the normal story. I think more often than not, people aren't having these discussions, and then there is conflict, because I think, when one sibling lives farther away, I think there's all kinds of different feelings that happen. So tell me, from the perspective of the person that didn't live close, you're talking to your mom and your sister and things about what is going on. Tell us what that was like for you, being the one that wasn't right there.
I can tell you about the first time that I visited after this whole thing started, and, I drove down or up to New York and got to the front door. My mother opened the door. She gave me her usual hug and kiss, and then said, "Go take care of your father." And that was a rude awakening.
Yeah.
Tough.
Was he angry at that time, or?
Well, yeah, we had our first bout at that time, actually. I trying to dress him, and he just refused to move. He would freeze up. That was the thing that I remember the most, in addition to the yelling at me. And it was very, very hard to address somebody when they won't move their limbs. And then he did what he did. He started screaming at me in German. And so it took me a while to recuperate from that and get used to that scenario. And fortunately, I was working from home, so I was able to spend, vacation time there, bring my family with me, and to help everybody to support my mother so she could have her time off a little bit and give my sister a rest. So that happened on the average of every 4 months. I was able to get there. And again, I always felt guilty that I wasn't there. So that worked on me too.
I can imagine, the guilt of not being there, but wanting to help. And certainly when you visit, seeing that they could really use your help is tough. It's not like you could necessarily pick up and move, as many of us can't, but that's also not an easy thing. So, kudos to you for being there several times a year and trying to help out. It sounds like your visits were very much appreciated by your mom and your sister.
Well, I hope so. They were focused. My mom was the caregiver. My dad was about 5'6". My mother was barely 5 foot tall. And that's something that plays into, any discussion about long-term care. Are you physically going to be able to take care of this person? So,
right.
My mom was a tough Canadian, and she, for her size, she was a strong woman, and she persevered for a long time. It was probably 7 years before she actually, started to use the plan that they had purchased. She didn't want to use it, and that's the way people were in those days. They waited till the end, and thank goodness we had it, though.
Yeah. So let's talk a little bit more about that policy and what it was able to do. Now, so you said that it was $50 a day for 1 year home care. So talk about that. When they did finally start using it, what did it do for them?
Well, to be blunt, when somebody has this issue and they get advanced problems with it, the urination is a big problem. So he would wet the bed virtually every night. And sometimes he would wet his clothes while she was dressing him to go out. And, so you can imagine the strength you have to hold back anger, and sometimes she couldn't. But anyway, the got to the point where he was hard to move. So we hired this really nice guy. I remember him very, very distinctly. And back in those days, he was working privately, so it wasn't as expensive as it is now. So the $50 a day paid for 3 hours of care. So what he would do every morning, he would stop it, take him out of bed, shave him, shower him. We changed the bathtub so he could walk in because he refused to lift his leg. So there was an issue at every point. And then he would dress him. And the VA at that point, we had engaged with them. They allowed him to go to a daycare 3 days a week. So as long as he was able to get him moving at that point, which he was, and we would put him on the chair and he'd go down the steps of the chair. And somehow when he had his breakfast, it was like a car starting in the morning, wouldn't turn over. As soon as he finished his breakfast, he was another person. And he was able to be more mobile. They picked him up in the van. They took him, did his exercises and his social routine over there. But those 3 hours, that guy was amazing. And the most important takeaway, I think, from that 3 hours is that my mother had her respite. We've heard the term respite care in the industry. But she could do what she wanted for those 3 hours in the morning, whether it be just sleep in or go shopping or go to an exercise class, but it gave her a breather. And I think that helped to add to her longevity because she did live 9 years past the time he'd passed away.
Yeah. Yeah. You bring up a great point. Caregivers, when they have to give that kind of care, they're often not taking care of themselves. And so I can see, just as you were describing that and describing, what all the respite caregiver was doing for your father, that had to be such a relief on your mom. I can't even imagine, what a relief that must have been for her to have that. So I know in talking to you previously, you have more experience than just the experience with your dad. I know your in-laws went through some care needs and things as well. And, the story of that was a little different. You want to maybe just at a high level tell us about that experience?
Oh, sure. I'll give you a sentence about each one. So I have 4 or 5 people in my family that experiences some level of long-term care. The first one was my wife's first father, real father. He had diabetes really bad and had his foot amputated and had lots of money. And he was coming to visit with us permanently. He had sent all his belongings to us and they filled up my garage. And then unfortunately, he passed away. So he never made it from California to Florida. So that was my first experience. And that was before I was ever in this industry. My stepfather-in-law had a bout with Medicare. And one of the things that stood out was while he was recouping from an illness, they wanted him to do certain things. He couldn't do them or didn't want to do them. And because he refused to it, they let us know that, hey, he's done here. Take him home. And we were not prepared because he was not mobile. And certainly that wouldn't have worked out. But unfortunately for him, too, he had a stroke. He went to the hospital and passed away several days after that. My mother-in-law, and I'll say my mother-in-law and father-in-law had money, but they didn't buy the policy. They didn't want to spend money. Who was I to sell them a long-term care policy anyway? But my mother-in-law had a bout with Medicaid, so I learned about the Medicaid system by having to sit with her and bring tons of paperwork to see if we could qualify for Medicaid. Finally, we got it done. She was in there for about 6 months, and then she passed away too. So all these experiences. My mother, like I said, she was strong. She lasted. When she passed away, she was sick for a couple of times in and out of the hospital, but she was fine. She always recuperated. But something happened with her, and 3 months later, she passed away, but we never had to use the policy. My sister was there for her. Yeah, like I said, I can walk the walk and talk the talk. It's not why I got into the industry. I just understand.
Right. Yeah. So that's quite an incredible variety of difference in situations between the Medicare, and the rehab coverage on Medicare. And when you don't cooperate, they send you home. Well, what are you supposed to do with them, right? When they're not ready to come home? I think it says a lot, because you're very unprepared for that. But what else do you do? And then I think your mother-in-law's situation is also pretty common in the fact that people, they have money. They probably could have afforded the policy, but chose not to plan, didn't want to spend the money on that. Or like you said, what do you know? You're the son-in-law, which I've always maintained that our family is the hardest ones to sell to sometimes. And then she ends up in a situation where she's looking at Medicaid. And, Medicaid's not easy either. It's not easy to qualify for, and the rigmarole that you go through can be challenging. So,
Certainly,
yeah.
that's an understatement.
Right. Right. Quite a variety. So, it sounds like to me that two things really were big in your dad's story, and certainly in contrast to some of those other experiences, and that is the fact that you guys did talk about it, and the fact that he did plan ahead, that coworker of yours that sold him that policy, even though it wasn't a huge policy by any means, by any standard, it gave a lot of help in his situation, which was amazing. So you guys did have the discussion before the need for care came up, but was there anything you missed in talking to your family? Was there anything that, even though you had those discussions, that maybe you should have talked about that too?
You know, I'm going to say maybe because I was in the business by then and I had been doing webinars and training agents, I kind of knew the verbiage. I followed my own verbiage. So I don't want to sound like I'm complimenting myself, but I think I knew what to do and how to lead the pack.
Right.
And that's what I did. And they listened to us. So I don't think we missed too many things. We good track of the money. I'll tell you this, my mother, I'll give her credit. She fought with the VA to get him 100% coverage because his final 3 years were in the VA hospital, in the nursing home hospital in Northport, Long Island, which she traveled 5 days a week, 45 minutes each way. But she had to go to battle, and that meant that not only with the VA, but with the medical program he was part of, the name escapes me at this point, and also some of the politicians got involved in her area. So she finally got permission, and because he had that 75% disability from the PTSD, they admitted him in the days where there was no way we could have kept him home. So we were lucky at that point. And so he lived out his last 3 years in a place that was relatively militarily run. And he loved that. He wore his Army hat every day, even till the day he passed. And my mother became part of the group. So, I think we did cover all the bases, which has helped me work with other agents because I can speak from experience. I can speak with clients that when I was out there selling, I could tell them my experiences. People pay attention. Hopefully, I've helped a few people by sharing ideas.
Yeah. Well, I mean, you practiced what you preached and it worked, right? So it's a good testimony. So thinking through your, years of experience in this business, and, what changes have you seen? Positive changes or negative changes? But what changes are you seeing that are going to impact families on this journey?
Well, yeah, this is going to be in May. It'll be 30 years that I've been in this business, and didn't come into it to sell insurance. Certainly, I came into the business to help a friend who had a brokerage, try to help them reorganize it. So it wasn't my goal to be an insurance salesman. Changes are the amount of people involved. We really had 2,000 to 3,000 agents nationwide when I started in the business. There was no lack of personnel to be out there promoting and selling in long-term care or home care only. So that's a big change. And as well as I do, recruiting is a big issue for us. Is we have a lot of people that are selling long-term care, but it's their career. It's a sidebar. And I think that our goal this year, I know we've talked about this, is to get some professionals. In other words, people that focus on long-term care. There's so many good options today. There weren't back 30 years ago, even further back. And now you can make a good career out of it. Just it's hard work. Like everybody says, what is success? Success is hard work. And it is hard work, but there's a lot to choose from. Money's an issue always, whether it's worth to spend the money, but there are lots of examples where we can give you, as they say, if you think the insurance is expensive, where do you start paying for the care? And I think that's something we always have to think of. And that leads us to caregiving. I think that is the biggest theme today. It wasn't so much in the past. 30 years ago, they didn't have statistics like we have now. And what's happening now in the industry is the focus from all these carriers is on caregiving. And so it's on my mom, my dad. What can we do to make sure that the caregiver has the tools to do the right job for the person who is, in my dad's case, who knows where he was in his world. But I knew where my mom was, and I knew where my sister was. I mean, for a small part, I knew where I was. So I think that's a big thing that's changed quite a bit now, and I think for the better. And, if we could just get more carriers to come back in, and we're starting to see that trend maybe, it's a positive, more participants in that way is a good trend that, when I started the business, there was over 100 companies that were selling long-term care. And now it's different, and the products are better now. A little more expensive, but again, better product.
Right, right. So a lot of change. And you're right. You really picked up on something that I definitely see a lot of, and that is that focus on the caregiver. We always said in the life insurance industry that you're buying this policy not for you, but for the ones you love. But I think the same is entirely true of long-term care insurance. It's really for your family, not so much for you, but for your family. Yes, it's going to take care of you, but in taking care of you, it takes care of them. Just like that policy on your dad. Yeah, it took care of him, but really it took care of your mom because it gave her a break and it helped her with those things that she just was really struggling to do. So
Yeah, that's a key takeaway. And I'll add one more story to it real quick is, my son is probably, at this time he was in his early 30s and he wanted to buy a life insurance policy. I insisted that he put a long-term care rider on that policy and he listened. So, he got in at a time where it was really inexpensive. So he listened. My daughter, she hasn't pulled the trigger on it, but what I'm saying about the policies now, there's a lot of options today for virtually everybody. We can do something for you. If not, we'll help you and guide you, which is something that the industries are doing now, is all the companies are participating in helping you find the care, where to go for it, and the support that they're offering, which that wasn't the case back in those days. They have what they call concierge services, where you speak to one person and they hold your hand, virtually through your claim or with your loved ones. So these are things, again, I would like to add that how the industry has changed a lot.
yeah, it certainly has in so many ways. And I think for the better, while prices might be a little more expensive, it's also a lot more stable. The carriers have learned a lot. And I think that's evidenced by those that are choosing to come back in. Like they feel comfortable with it. They've learned a lot just about how, people are using their policies, how they're keeping and paying for their policies and all of those things. So I think it is a good thing for the industry. So we're running close on time here, and I just want to end with one more question for you. What's one thing that you learned in your journey about caregiving or taking care of people, but one thing you learned that nobody really tells you?
Yeah, I know that is an interesting question. Since being in the business for 30 years, people have told me a lot. I don't think I could be creative on that level, but I'll say one thing for those that may be listening to this. There's an old saying, something good is better than nothing. But purchasing something good is better than nothing at all. And I think the illustration of my parents' small policy and what it did for them is something that I think that I would like to share that with everybody. So if you're thinking about purchasing a plan and somebody offers you something that you said, well, that's not going to cover very much, buy it anyway. Because when the money's there, when you need it, you'll thank that person who talked to you into buying it. So, that and having the conversation, it's all about that. It's all about the conversation. Talk to your family. Holidays are coming, a great opportunity to get people together and have the tough conversation. It will be a tough conversation in some cases. But you know what? In the long run, you'll thank everybody that participated in it.
Sure. And you can say, hey, I just watched this podcast and this is what they said. And what do you think? Right. We just gave you a great opening for those Thanksgiving and holiday conversations.
Yes, I think so. I think one other thing, keeping the family together through the conversation is important because I'll tell you, because our family talked, when my mom passed away, there was a lot of work to be done, physical, financial. And we just had a ball doing it because we just cooperated. And it was a carryover from my father. And we had established some really good groundwork. And I think that's important. And that all came from talking it out. And everybody knew their role. Nobody had any. So, again, talk to your family.
There you go.
Important.
There's a big takeaway for you. And on that note, we will wrap it there. Talk to your families. Thank you, Richard, for sharing your story, for sharing Morton's story and the story of your in-laws and the rest of your family. We really appreciate it. I know everybody took away a lot from that, as did I. So thank you for that. And look for a new episode of the In Between Years next month. We will see you then. Thank you.